Right, so you guys sent us down a pretty deep rabbit hole this time
Yeah.
with this transcript
I know, right?
from a YouTube video called Modet Clif High Explorer's Guide to Sci-Fi World.
Really gets you thinking.
It does. It really does.
Is that
Dated
what
April
it is?
9th.
Yeah, April 9th.
And, it throws a very different light on our current kind of economic situation.
Sure.
And you're all clearly looking to understand if, like, the ground is shifting
Yeah.
beneath our feet in some fundamental ways.
Yeah, what are the tectonic plates doing right now
Totally.
underneath the system that we all live in?
Yeah, exactly.
And we're gonna
I think that's a great way to put it, yeah.
we're gonna try to unpack
Yeah.
the key ideas presented in this video
Sure.
and see what stands out.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to hear what you guys pulled out of this.
Well, what immediately struck us
Yeah.
is the speaker's framing of today's kind of economic environment.
He posits that we've entered a significant economic or currency war with
Yeah.
the EU, China, and the U.S., each maneuvering kind of strategically.
Yeah.
And it's a perspective that really kind of encourages you to see beyond just the daily headlines and consider this larger geopolitical struggle playing out through economic means.
A lot of people are saying, are we entering World War III?
Yeah.
And he's kind of saying, yeah, we already are.
Yeah, it's already happening.
Just being fought in a different way.
Yeah, it's an economic war.
Right.
It's really interesting.
It's really interesting to think about, yeah.
So this economic war is supposedly linked to the death of the petrodollar.
Right.
For our listeners who might not be totally steeped in this,
Sure.
could you briefly explain what the petrodollar system is and why its potential demise is such a big deal?
Yeah, so essentially since the mid-1970s, the U.S. dollar has been the primary currency used for international oil transactions. This is huge because what it's created is a consistent global demand for dollars.
Right.
Right. Because everybody needs oil.
Right.
So they need dollars to buy it.
Got it.
And so this is, it's led to the dollar being the world's reserve currency.
Right.
And it's given the U.S. a lot of power and influence on the global stage.
Okay.
The speaker in this video is suggesting that this system is fracturing.
Okay.
And that we're going to be moving to new forms of currency, potentially backed by something else.
Okay.
Which is a very bold claim.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's true remains to be seen.
Right.
But I think a lot of people are starting to think about that.
Yeah. It's a fascinating concept.
It is. It is.
And he then contrasts this current period with past economic cycles.
Right.
He mentions the tech boom of the late 90s and the rise of cryptocurrencies. Yeah. What's his take on why this time feels different?
Well, he basically highlights the fact that we're not seeing the same kind of rapid wealth creation. Yeah. Exuberant growth.
Yeah.
Like we saw in those periods. Yeah. This was a time, those were times of huge gains, right? Yeah. Like the dot-com boom and then the crypto boom.
Yeah.
But instead of that, he's saying that we're in a deflationary environment.
Okay, and that's interesting because we've been hearing a lot about inflation recently.
Right, exactly.
So deflation, just in simple terms, it's like the opposite. It's like a general decline in prices.
Right, exactly.
For goods and services.
Yeah, your money is worth more.
Right.
And things cost less.
Got it.
So it's interesting that he's saying this because, like you said, we've been hearing so much about inflation.
Right.
But he's saying, actually, we're entering a period of deflation.
Okay, and what's driving this deflation, according to him?
Well, he mentions this crackdown on illegal and black money.
Okay.
And, suggests that this effort to curb illicit financial activities is actually contributing to this deflationary pressure.
Okay. So,
which is interesting because, a lot of people would say, it's about supply chains or it's about, interest rates.
Right.
But he's saying, no, it's actually about this kind of hidden world of finance.
Right. Got it.
And that's actually what's driving this deflation.
This leads into kind of a dramatic point where he references Trump's statement about a truly horrible discovery.
Right.
And speculating that it could involve deep black project money machines.
Oh, yeah, that's where this gets really interesting.
This is where it gets really
out there.
It's conventional territory.
Yeah, it's like going down the rabbit hole, right?
Right, totally.
The idea of hidden off the books financial mechanisms operating on a massive scale. This is a huge claim.
Yeah.
And without concrete evidence,
right.
It's difficult to assess the validity. But it's really interesting that he's bringing this up.
Yeah.
Because it kind of makes you think,
right.
Are there things going on behind the scenes
that
we're not even aware of?
And this is where it gets really unique, I guess is a good way of putting it.
Okay.
He alleges a long-standing control of the U.S. by Israel
Right.
tied to suppressing the reverse engineering of alien technology.
Right.
Now, the purported reason
Yeah.
to prop up the Jew-owned oil industry?
Yeah, this is where, he gets into some pretty controversial territory.
For sure.
He's basically saying
Right.
that...
Regardless of those claims.
Right, regardless of those claims.
What's the logic that he's presenting?
Okay, so the logic he's presenting is that if free energy technologies derived from alien sources were to become public, then demand for oil would plummet. Right. And that would render vast oil reserves and related industries obsolete. And so he's suggesting that this suppression of these technologies is a deliberate act to maintain the economic power associated with the existing energy paradigm.
Got it.
So it's a pretty out there theory.
Yeah.
But it's interesting nonetheless.
It's definitely interesting.
Yeah.
And this brings us to this concept of zero-point technology, or a ZPT. How does he define this?
Well, he defines it basically as energy out of the air. Basically free and limitless energy. That would eliminate our need for traditional fuels and electricity generation.
Got it.
He really emphasizes that energy access is this fundamental determinant of societal development and points out the vast global disparities that currently exist.
Of course.
And so his point is that ZPT could equalize access and revolutionize human civilization.
Okay, so as with, most revolutionary ideas, there's a catch.
Of course.
He believes that introducing ZPT,
even with its immense benefits, would trigger a catastrophic economic collapse. Why does he think that?
Well, because he's arguing that the moment that ZPT becomes a credible possibility, investors are going to foresee the eventual demise of oil and gas industries and all these related sectors, and they're going to start selling off their assets. And that's going to cause huge turmoil in financial markets.
Got it. So it wouldn't even...
Particularly debt and bonds that are heavily invested in these areas. So basically he's saying that the collapse wouldn't even wait for the technology to be fully implemented. Just the expectation of it would be enough to trigger it.
Okay, so this kind of leads us to his perspective on our debt-based economy. Could you elaborate on what characterizes a debt-based system and why he believes it's so precarious?
Yeah, so basically in a debt-based economy...
Money is created through the issuance of debt. Right. So you go to a bank, you get a loan. That money is created out of thin air.
Got it.
And that's how our system works. And most modern nations have been operating this way ever since we established central banking systems. And so he's highlighting that these systems really rely on continuous growth and the creation of new debt to function. And so he's saying if we were to just pay off all the debt, the system would actually collapse.
Wow.
Because it wouldn't be able to function anymore.
Interesting. So it can't actually be unwound.
Exactly. It can't be unwound.
Wow.
Because it relies on that debt to exist.
Got it.
Which is a very interesting concept.
It is. It is.
And he goes so far as to call our current situation the ultimate deflation. Suggesting the end of this debt-based era. And he contrasts that with Trump's apparent desire for a stable world. He wants things to be calm. He wants things to be peaceful.
Yeah, he wants to make America great again.
Exactly. But he's saying, look, these two things might be incompatible. Because the system itself is inherently unstable.
Got it.
And so even if you want to maintain it, it might not be possible.
Wow.
He uses the example of, the 19th century in the U.S. We had these huge shifts in the monetary system. And they were very turbulent times.
Of course.
So he's saying, we might be headed for something similar.
So in this, deflationary environment, what are the typical responses that, governments and central banks use?
Yeah, governments and central banks typically use to try and keep the system afloat.
Right. So what they typically do is they try to inject more liquidity into the system.
Okay.
Right. So they will, print more money.
Yeah.
They'll lower interest rates.
Yeah.
They'll do all sorts of things.
To try and encourage borrowing and spending.
Right.
But he's saying that those things aren't really working anymore.
Why not?
Well, he's saying that in the case of the dollar,
yeah,
it's because the dollar's purchasing power is weakening.
Okay.
So even if you print more dollars,
right,
it's not really having the same effect
Got it.
that it used to.
Okay.
And he also touches on this idea of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies.
Right.
And this was, something that was being talked about a lot as a way to potentially manage spending and kind of control the monetary system.
Got it.
But what's his take on CBDCs?
Yeah. Are they viable in his eyes?
He's pretty skeptical.
Okay.
He's saying, look, even with CBDCs, we're still going to have these boom and bust cycles that are inherent in a debt-based system.
Got it.
And he also thinks that there's going to be a lot of social resistance to CBDCs.
Yeah, people don't like change.
Right. People like their privacy. They like their paper money.
Right.
They're not going to want to give that up.
So let's revisit this truly horrible discovery and these alleged black projects, black money machines.
Yeah, this is a really key part of his argument.
Yeah.
And he seems to believe that this hidden financial layer is key to understanding what's going on in our world today.
Okay.
He postulates that if there's all this off-book money in circulation, that could potentially explain why we've had this massive expansion of debt instruments since the 1970s.
Got it.
Right.
Right.
And he's talking about, trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars.
Almost unimaginable.
A mind-boggling amount of money.
Yeah.
And if that were to be revealed, it would obviously have huge implications.
Of course.
So if the publicly known amount of dollars is just a fraction of what's actually circulating, what would be the consequences of this revelation? Well, he's saying it would be catastrophic. He's saying it would trigger a massive loss of confidence in the dollar and lead to a rapid flight of capital and just severe market instability.
Got it.
And this is all happening at a time when we're already in this deflationary environment.
Right.
So it's a recipe for disaster.
So essentially, he's saying it would just crush the system.
It would crush the system.
Wow. And even without a public reveal, just shutting down these alleged black money operations would have consequences, right?
Absolutely.
Like, what kind of consequences are we talking about?
Well, he points out that there's a lot of entities that depend on this flow of funds from these alleged operations. So you've got subcontractors, you've got parts of the military-industrial complex. You've got all sorts of people who are relying on this money.
Wow.
And so if that were to suddenly dry up, it would cause a lot of problems.
Of course.
It would lead to financial distress.
Right.
It could even lead to social unrest.
So he seems pretty critical of the current approach.
Yeah.
Particularly, Trump's teams suggesting that they're not grasping the magnitude
he does.
of the changes underway.
Yeah, he's basically saying that they're trying to manage this deflation, but they're doing it in a very conventional way.
Okay.
And he doesn't think that that's going to work.
Right.
Because he thinks the changes that are coming are so radical.
Right.
That the old ways of doing things just aren't going to cut it.
Yeah, and he even uses these, terms like normies and references, their Jesuit training as a potential limitation.
Right. He's kind of saying that they're stuck in this old paradigm.
Yeah.
And they're not able to see the new possibilities that are emerging.
Got it.
And he's specifically talking about technologies like anti-gravity and ZPT.
Yeah.
As well as broader societal shifts. He's talking about the decline of religion.
Right.
And all sorts of other things.
So it's interesting. He's saying that...
It's like he's saying that the world is changing.
Right.
And they're just not keeping up.
They're stuck in the old way of thinking.
Exactly.
Wow. And he's pretty firm in his belief that a significant shift is inevitable.
Regardless of any political actions.
Right. It's just going to happen.
Exactly.
He points to current economic indicators as evidence of an organic crisis within the debt system itself.
Yeah, so he's looking at things like Wall Street losses, the timing of, crypto market movements. And he's saying these are not just, fluctuations in a normal market cycle.
Yeah.
This is something much deeper.
Right. Something fundamental is happening.
Exactly.
Wow. And he even offers this really unique perspective on tariffs.
I know, right?
Seeing them as a way to reduce our reliance on borrowing.
I mean, most people, when they think about tariffs, they think about protectionism. They think about, trade wars.
Right.
But he's saying, look, actually, tariffs can be used to reduce the amount of debt that we have.
Okay.
Because if you make imported goods more expensive, people are going to buy less of them.
Okay.
And that means we're going to have to borrow less money
Got it.
to finance our consumption.
Got it.
So it's a really interesting way of looking at tariffs.
Right.
It's a very different perspective.
And he also touches on the potential for intense competition among bonds and the importance of U.S. bonds maintaining their supremacy.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, why is that so crucial?
Well, because the strength of U.S. Treasury bonds is really what underpins the strength of the U.S. dollar.
Okay.
Right. If people lose confidence in U.S. bonds, they're going to lose confidence in the dollar.
Got it.
And that could lead to a collapse of the dollar as the world's reserve currency.
Okay, so the U.S. really needs its bonds.
It needs its bonds to be seen as the safest, most reliable investment in the world.
Got it.
Otherwise, the whole system could come crashing down.
And he even shares this really personal anecdote.
Yeah, about this local family.
You're right, experiencing these multiple deaths.
Yeah.
And he links that to their ability to participate in the debt-based economy.
It's an interesting connection to make.
It is. It's a little bit of a stark connection.
It is.
But what do you think he's trying to get at there?
Well, I think he's trying to highlight how intertwined our lives are with this debt-based financial system.
Okay.
And so he's saying, look, when this system starts to break down, it's not just going to be about, numbers on a screen.
Right.
It's going to have real-world consequences for real people.
Yeah. And ultimately, he anticipates this shift to a sound money system.
Right.
What does he mean by that?
So what he's talking about is a monetary system that's not based on debt.
Okay.
And that's not subject to these inflationary pressures that we see in our current system.
Got it.
And so historically, this has been linked to currencies that are backed by precious metals.
Right, like gold.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he sees this as a way to move away from what he calls object materialism.
Okay.
Which I think is an interesting way of putting it.
It is.
But he's not saying that this transition is going to be easy.
Right.
He thinks it's going to be very lengthy.
Right.
Potentially chaotic.
Yeah.
He even estimates that, the full adoption of something like a CBDC could take, 20 plus years.
Wow. So it's a long road ahead.
It's a long road ahead.
And what about our listeners out there who might be hoping for a repeat of the past?
Sure.
Rapid wealth accumulation like the tech boom or the crypto surge. What's his outlook on that?
Well, he's very cautious.
Okay.
He's basically saying that the kind of gains that we saw in those periods are unlikely to be repeated because the system itself is changing.
Right.
He's particularly skeptical about crypto.
Okay.
He doesn't think that we're going to see a return to those all-time highs.
Got it. Okay.
That we saw a couple of years ago.
And he does see some potential for wealth creation in the future.
He does, yeah.
Particularly with the emergence of ZPT.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the nature of that wealth creation would be quite different.
It would be very different.
Yeah, so how so?
So basically he's saying that the opportunities are going to be tied to the actual production and implementation of these technologies.
Got it.
So instead of, just speculating on, which crypto is going to go up, you're actually going to have to be involved in building and creating these new technologies.
Yeah. Okay, and he uses the example of the, pre-1913 era with the dollar linked to gold.
Yeah, this is kind of his model for what he would call a sound money system.
Right.
Right, where, inflation wasn't driven by the expansion of credit.
Yeah.
It was driven by the discovery of new gold.
Got it.
So if you found more gold, there was more money.
Right.
But it didn't devalue the existing money.
Right. Okay, that's interesting.
It's a very different way of thinking about money.
It is. And so, to kind of wrap up this deep dive into this really unique perspective.
Yes, it's a very unique perspective.
We've explored this idea of an ongoing economic war, the potential demise of the petrodollar, these highly speculative claims around hidden financial activities, and alien technology suppression, the disruptive potential of zero-point technology, and a possible long-term transition to a sound money future.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary of what he's talking about.
Yeah, and it's definitely thought-provoking.
It is. It is.
Even if it is kind of unconventional.
It definitely challenges
a
lot of the assumptions that we have about how the world works.
About how the world works, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and that's really, I think, where we'll leave it for you guys to consider.
Yeah.
What are the implications if the fundamental nature of energy and money undergoes radical change?
Right.
What role does individual awareness and adaptability play
in navigating these times?
In navigating these uncertain times.
Yeah, because
it's a lot to digest.
A lot to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course.
This is a fascinating conversation.
It really was.
I'm still kind of processing it all.
Yeah, it's a lot.
But it's really good stuff.
Yeah, definitely gets you thinking.
Yeah, for sure.